Good morning. And per my tradition, assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. It is a great privilege and a joy for me to be here with you. I am particularly grateful to STL, not only for the remarkable teamsmanship and leadership of their head, Ingrid Rosendorf-Joyce, who managed to put together an incredible program for me, but really, quite frankly, for valuing the affiliation with Religions for Peace. For those of you who may not know Religions for Peace, the easiest way to describe it, as somebody who worked in the UN for 20 years, the easiest way to describe Religions for Peace is whereas the United Nations has 193 governments making it up, Religions for Peace has approximately 100 faith communities that make it up, religious institutions and faith communities. So everything from the Vatican to the indigenous peoples, different indigenous peoples groups in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, all sit on Religions for Peace's board. So this, imagine, is, to some extent, the UN of religions and faiths. Yesterday, for those of you who were able to be with us, we had the tour de force from one of Religions for Peace's legends, truly a legend, and that is Bishop Gunnar Stalset, who sits here. It's been 3.5 years into the position that I now serve as Secretary General, and I felt for the first time that I had learned and understood not just the history of Religions for Peace, but more critically to the issue of interfaith dialogue, how it is that interfaith dialogue in action is fundamentally, politically, socially, and culturally relevant. It isn't as if we have our lives, here's the financial, here's the military, here's the political, here's the judicial, and then there's the religious. On the contrary, for 8 out of 10 people around the world, the affiliation to a particular faith tradition is part of their identity. I know it may somehow be difficult to understand that in a context like Norway, but we're looking at the rest of the world. And in the rest of the world, 8 out of 10 people affiliate to or identify with a faith. That is a remarkable constituency of human beings. And therefore, it is honestly quite odd that we would proceed to assume that we could put faith on the side and do our lives, the rest of our lives. In point of fact, for those of us who grew up in societies where faith is part of the fabric of our social, moral, cultural, and political realities, religions are not just an aspect of faith. They are an aspect of politics, and they are an aspect of finance. They are an aspect of defense. That interlinkage between religion and the rest of our lives is a lot like the DNA that runs in our blood. Might be a bit difficult for secular context to understand it, but my first point that I wish to bring to you is to please appreciate that for most people around the world, religion is not something out there. Religion is not an apart or an other. It is very much part of the fabric of our human consciousness. It doesn't mean religion only. It is faith, frankly. It is faith in something. I've not met many people who will say, I believe in absolutely nothing. We all believe in something. That is our faith. 50 years ago, when Religions for Peace was founded, the terrain of work on religion, or religions around the world, that terrain was very, very different. And it has changed dramatically over the last 50 years, but it has particularly changed over the last 5 years. What was different then and now? In the beginning, in 1970, when Religions for Peace was founded, it took a group of incredibly committed religious leaders from different parts of the world and different faith traditions to come together with a deep understanding that our multilateral system, i.e. the United Nations, needs a little bit of support to achieve the kind of peace it was set up to achieve. Not just peace as an absence of war, but peace as in all the components that afford human dignity. Peace, as in the components that are affording human dignity, is everything under the sun. It's not just the satisfaction of our basic needs, but it is an ability to lift up our not just needs for water or food, shelter, but really human dignity is about uplifting our very spirit and our sense of one another and our respect for the diversities that fundamentally define us. The religious leaders who came together in 1970 were deeply concerned about what they thought then was the likelihood of a nuclear war. Is it not ironic that 53 years later, we are still deeply afraid of a nuclear war? So one of the skeptics I spoke with not so long ago said, well, doesn't look like the coming together of religious leaders and faith leaders did much, does it? It's still the same fears, still the same concerns, still the same worries. But something has changed. I owe a great deal of what I know about Religions for Peace to a man who served as Secretary General before me. His name was Dr. William Vendley, who believes very passionately that when religions work together, frankly, there is no possibility of war. It just doesn't happen. In his articulation of this, he makes an extremely important point, which our legend, Bishop Gunnar Stålsett, also articulated yesterday, that human dignity is a constant and consistent struggle, and that you cannot possibly achieve it by denying human beings their faith. You don't have to prioritize the faith above all, but you cannot afford to deny the faith. Over the last 50 years, within the UN system, the United Nations system, it became clear that if we work to alienate and marginalize, or at least to not consider and ignore religions, we actually find ourselves in a vortex of doing the same problems, same problems, same problems. So what difference does the religious make? Over the last 25 years, it became very clear to me when I was working on religion inside the UN system that there was, among some governments, remember the UN is governments, there was among some governments an understanding and an appreciation of just how crucial religion is and faith is to people's lives. But it was approached with a certain understanding that we could use religion, and I quote, we can use religion to affirm the secular process of political, social, cultural, and economic life. We can use religious leaders to rubber stamp that which is already being done, surely in the right way, because the UN never does anything wrong. So we just need to get the religious leaders to stamp and say, this is it, this is good, great stuff, keep going. Now, it didn't get any easier when some religious leaders would actually sit in settings with the UN officials and say, yes, absolutely use us. By all means, use us, because perhaps we can teach you a thing or two. It also didn't get much better. This concern about instrumentalizing religion didn't get any better when some religious leaders and many faith communities were only too happy to simply sit at that same policy-making table and be considered as part of this global political elite. And either be quiet because they're so grateful to be on this table, or, and this was the more problematic thing for people like me, or start to figure out how it is that the UN can be used for their particular understandings, aspirations, and purposes. You see, instrumentalization is a two-way road. And where we are today is at that stage where the religious would wish to instrumentalize the political, social, and economic, and the political, social, and economic would wish to instrumentalize the religious. It's a particular marriage, which, in my humble opinion, and excuse my English, is a marriage made in hell. We heard and we know today that one of the biggest challenges we're facing, apart from the planetary crisis, the public health crisis, the financial crisis, the political legitimacy crisis, one of the biggest crises that is interwoven with all of these, quite frankly, is the crisis of religious politics and the politicization of the religious. We live at that moment now. For those of you who live here in Norway and don't see it, it's not because it's not happening. You're not looking hard enough. We are at the cusp in human history where we go back, actually, to the empires of old. And in case any of you have forgotten, there used to be something called the Austro-Hungarian, the Habsburg, the Ottoman. They were very religious entities. They were run with close coordination between the political and the religious. If you wish to go back a little bit further to where the country I come from, Pharaoh was a god and the political ruler. So in fact, one of the oldest ways of existing for human beings is in that space where politics and religion coincide. It's not new. We're, the secular, new. But the old, the traditional, the normal, for so long throughout our history, has been where the religious has a very critical role to play with the political, and the political has a very critical role to play in the religious realms. We stand today at a moment in time when, unless we are deliberately and consciously aware of the fact that many religious institutions and religious leaders are part of the political baggage and realities in many parts of the world, unless we are aware of that, we may find ourselves wondering why it is that different religions are at war with one another, even when they come from exactly the same umbrella. Orthodox, anyone remember? If there is one lesson to be learned from the current dynamics of the war in Ukraine, it is to see how both a political leader and a religious leader, very influential ones, have exactly the same agenda. There is no difference in that agenda. But wait, why did it have to come to Europe for y'all to realize that? Because in so many other parts of the world, it's been like that for a very long time. The political and religious agendas, some religious agendas, have always been working in tandem with one another. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel. Under Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, it was a very, very close relationship between the political and the religious. Under the Trump administration in the United States, very close relationships between certain religious and the political. So it might be wise to just pause to consider why we haven't necessarily noticed that trend yet. Because it's not about different exceptions to the rule. It may well be that that was always the rule, and that what happened in a certain part of the world, like Western Europe, especially the Nordic countries, but not only, what happened in this part of the world was actually the exception to the rule. And if we can change that mindset and put that hat on, where we understand that religion and politics have been bedfellows for the longest possible time in most parts of the world, actually, then we might be a bit more clairvoyant about where we think this might go. And here's one clearly defining feature of the politicization of the religions and the religious politicization. The clear feature is, historically, anywhere in the world where that marriage between religion and politics takes place, is this: it is never multi-religious. It is one religion aligning with a political space, process, leader, context, institution. One religion. Perhaps, since Einstein told us that genius is in recognizing the obvious, perhaps we can recognize the genius of this particular understanding. That if one religion dominates and coalesces with the political order, maybe we're in trouble. Because if you look historically at the ways in which the empires of old and the present realities happen, it is very rarely ever that you see that it is 2 or 3 or 4 religions who are aligning with a political order. On the contrary, in India, it's very clearly the Hindu faith. In some parts of Sri Lanka and Thailand and Myanmar, it's parts of the Buddhist faith. In the Muslim world, it's the Muslim faith. So what if we actually are in the middle of the space where religion and politics are having too cozy a relationship for a long time, but we know that this cozy relationship is fundamentally challenged when religions work together. When religious leaders come together in one space with a common objective, it is almost impossible for any of them to either become a fundamentalist, let alone an extremist, because the very premise of coming together with our faith traditions to address a common problem is the art of diplomacy and compromise. My faith will not and cannot be better than yours. Your faith will not and cannot be better than mine. Hey, guess what? Level playing field. There is a certain reality to this, that when religions work together, the opportunities for any form of religious extremism are not just diminished, but there is no space, therefore. When religions work together towards a common goal, we have an opportunity to experience God's mercy. After all, we realize that when faiths come together to work and serve a common goal, we have an opportunity for an alliance of human dignity. Because the most common of the common goals is human dignity. But wait, there is also an alliance of religions, certain religious beliefs who come together around some really conservative issues that have to do with certain human rights. It's actually visible and persistent, and you can see it in the context of the United Nations as well. Hindu, Muslim, Catholic, some Buddhist come together as nation states, as governments, inspired by their religious partnerships and alliances in their own home country. And over the last 25 to 30 years, they have systematically voted against certain human rights. In intergovernmental negotiations, the word gender, you know it's going to be a long night when the word gender has now come up in a intergovernmental treaty format, negotiation. And you will start hearing the same spiel about this is the door to all sorts of terrible stuff. If you say gender, that's the worst thing ever, then we're going to go into homosexuality and all the things that are absolutely terrible. We're not going there, remove the word gender. Women's rights, yes, okay, women's rights, yeah, that's all right. But gender, And you realize that it's actually a multi-religious alliance hiding behind governments or spurring certain governments to insist. And they're powerful. They are extremely powerful. They stand together as Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, and Muslim. They stand together as governments against these human rights. So then, it isn't just about religions working together, is it? It can't be the only measuring stick that we would see for human dignity. Religions working together, yes. Religions working together to uphold human rights, now that is dignity. So it's not good enough to say this is a multi-religious alliance that is working for, I don't know, could be family, which is a byword for something else entirely. What we do need to understand is that the criteria we have today, the measuring stick we must have, two measuring sticks, litmus test. When you see different religious actors and religious leaders, organizations, institutions, faith-based NGOs come together, the question to ask, especially when they are very proud and pleased to be working together, the question to ask is, where are you on women's rights and LGBT, possibly, perhaps? Where are you exactly? The answer will tell you where they are on human rights. There is another litmus test to ask the different religious leaders and faith-based NGOs. Where are you on certain political issues that are often presented as religious tensions. And you'll be able to see where they stand on the different human rights agendas. In 2022, and forgive me for those of you who have heard me say this already, I repeat, in 2022, I counted 50 international multi-religious leaders meetings. 50. The last few were, I would think, rather expensive to put together. Hosted by the Shangri-La and the Ritz-Carlton, and what hotel have you got me in right now? This space of interreligious and multi-religious collaboration is quickly being exploited by some of the very same governments who are very selective, and I'm being diplomatic, are very selective about human rights. They cherry-pick human rights, when we all know for a fact that you cannot distinguish human rights from one another, that the whole point of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that it is about the non-divisibility, the interdependence, and the universality. So you can't come and say, I like this one, and I like this one. Sometimes this one could be freedom of religion and belief. Hey, we're going to focus on that. That's our thing. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. If freedom of religion and belief, which, by the way, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is understood as freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. Thank you very much to our way ahead of us humanists. Freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief. It ain't about religion only. For those of you who know the articulation in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you also know that you cannot cherry-pick religious freedom out of the continuum of freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. You don't pick freedom of religion and decide that that's going to be your end-all and be-all, because there's a lot of other 17 set of human rights that need this, and this needs them. And this ability to cherry-pick and get away with it is part of what makes secular civil society a little bit uncomfortable, to put it mildly. It's part of what makes those who don't adhere to any particular religion get a bit unsettled. Why is it only this particular human right that you think so highly of? That is the other litmus test. First litmus test, to ask religious communities, where do you stand on women's rights issues? Where do you stand on gender? Second litmus test, which human rights exactly are you fighting for? Oh, gee, and why is it only that one? Human dignity will never be realized when we think one particular set of rights is more important than another. Fact. It is the continuum of human rights that guarantees human dignity. Multi-religious collaboration in service to all human rights is the only opportunity we have to switch a very real tsunami coming our way. Ironically, a tsunami called religion. Religions will be used against human rights, are being used as we speak against human rights. It's not a good development, to put it very politely. It is a danger that comes our way. When I was counting 50 meetings in the course of 1 year, I had this funny sense of déjà vu. Why does this feel very familiar? And I realized I'm a product of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the struggle for human rights, for democracy, for good governance. Remember when those were really big issues? And I realized that I was experiencing a déjà vu because also, by the time we got to the 90s, human rights, good governance, and democracy were everybody's business. There were new organizations, a gazillion meetings taking place all over the world on different aspects of human rights, governance, and democracy. It was the in thing. Everyone was working on human rights, governance, and democracy. New NGOs were sprouting every day on aspects like this. Some of them had no clue what they were on about, but they knew there was money in this space, so therefore we were going to specialize in this space. The same thing is happening. If we look back 30 years, do we have, after all that investment in human rights, in good governance, in democracy, do we have a world which is more democratic, more human rights oriented, and more governed by good governance? Do we have such a world? Because if you see it, I really don't. And we cannot afford to go there when it comes to people's faith. We cannot afford to go there when it comes to human dignity. We have to understand what those two litmus tests are for genuine multi-religious engagement and collaboration for the common good. And the common good is all of human rights, indivisible, interdependent, and universal. That is multi-religious collaboration for human rights. We have to work to make that happen. At a minimum, we need to ensure that all our religious leaders and faith communities are on side with the whole human rights agenda. Not forget it and not cherry pick it, but honor human dignity. Thank you.